Welcome to Reformed Thinking.
It's good to be here with you. We're two friends, fellow believers who hold to the Westminster Confession, and today we get to open up the scriptures together.
And not just the scriptures, but some of the great commentary that's been handed down to us.
That's right. We're looking at what the saints of old have to say.
We have a pretty substantial task ahead of us today. We're turning our full attention to Psalm 74. But we're not just going to read it on its own. We're going to be looking at it through a very specific lens.
We are. We're using the monumental work by the Prince of Preachers, Charles Haddon Spurgeon.
The Treasury of David.
The Treasury of David, yes. I mean, it's a resource that, every Christian home should probably have. Spurgeon didn't just write down his own thoughts.
No, he was more like a curator, wasn't he?
That's the perfect word for it. He gathered the sharpest insights from, everyone. The church fathers, the Puritans, the reformers.
And then he weaves his own voice in with them.
He does. It's like having a whole library in just one set of books. It's
Yeah.
fantastic.
And Psalm 74 is a heavy text.
Right.
I spent the last couple of days just reading through it, and the notes and the mood is, well, it's undeniably desolate.
It is. It deals with what we'd call the suffering church.
It really gets at that terrifying gut-level feeling you get when it seems like God has just gone silent, like he's abandoned his people.
And that's the central tension, isn't it? The whole psalm is anchored in a reformed understanding of God's sovereignty, but at the same time, it is brutally honest about the emotional reality of feeling cast off.
It's labeled as a Maschil of Asaph.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we should pause on that title for a second. We often just skip right over those superscriptions in our daily reading.
We do, but they give us so much context.
Yeah, what's the significance of Maschil? What does that mean?
Maschil means it's an instructive psalm. Its main purpose is to teach us something.
So it's not just a song, it's a lesson.
Exactly. And Spurgeon points out something I think is really insightful here. He says the history of the suffering church is always edifying.
That's a bit counterintuitive, isn't it? You'd think we'd learn more from the victories.
You would. But Spurgeon argues that it's in the dark nights, in the laments. That's where the real curriculum of the faith is found.
So this isn't just a complaint. It's a lesson plan for the believer.
That's a great way to put it. It's teaching us that when these fiery trials happen, it's not some strange thing. We're walking a path that the saints have walked for centuries.
It frames our suffering not as an accident, but as a period of instruction.
That's it. Now, the author is listed as Asaph. But Spurgeon in the source material seems to really wrestle with the timeline here.
He does. The title says Asaph, but the psalm describes the complete and total destruction of the temple.
Right. The sanctuary being burned, the carved work smashed to pieces.
But the famous Asaph, the one we all know, was King David's contemporary. He lived when the temple was being planned, or maybe just being built.
He certainly didn't live to see it destroyed by the Babylonians centuries later, so there's a disconnect.
How does Spurgeon try to resolve that?
Well, he lays out three main possibilities that commentators have suggested. First, it could be a prophetic song.
Meaning the Spirit of God gave the original Asaph a vision of the future.
Yes, a vision of the destruction by Nebuchadnezzar, or maybe even looking forward to the Romans in 70 A.D.
And that would fit with how we see prophecy working in other psalms.
It would. Spurgeon says there's really no difficulty in supposing that. But he gives a second option, too.
Which is?
That Asaph became a sort of family title, a bit like Pharaoh in Egypt or Caesar in Rome. So this could be a descendant of the original Asaph, writing hundreds of years later.
Maybe during the invasion of Sennacherib or the Maccabean Wars.
Exactly. But regardless of the specific date, I think the mission for our deep dive today is pretty clear.
Yeah. We need to understand how the faithful should behave, how we should pray. When the church is under fire and it feels like God is just silent.
And that whole inquiry starts in the very first verse, with a cry that has just echoed down through the ages.
Oh God, why hast thou cast us off forever?
I mean, what a question.
It's just so heavy. Why hast thou cast us off? It feels so permanent, like an abyss of misery. And I have to think that a lot of people listening can relate to that feeling, that sense that the silence of God is a door slamming shut for good.
Oh, absolutely. And Spurgeon acknowledges that. He says to be cast off at all is hard, but to feel deserted forever, I think he calls it an evil beyond endurance.
The chief of woes.
Yes. But right after acknowledging the emotion, Spurgeon offers a vital theological correction.
Because if we hold to the doctrines of grace, If we believe in the perseverance of the saints, God can't cast off his people forever.
Precisely. Spurgeon points us right to Romans 11:1. Hath God cast away his people? God forbid. So the question the psalmist asks, why hast thou cast us off, actually has a negative answer.
So the psalmist is asking a question that's based on a false premise.
In a sense, yes. He's asking based on his feeling, on his perception, not on the ultimate reality of the covenant. So Spurgeon draws this really helpful distinction between God casting off his people, which implies total rejection, and God hiding his face.
Which implies chastisement.
Yes, that is a crucial difference, isn't it? Rejection is a judge passing a final sentence. Chastisement is a father disciplining a son he loves.
And that changes everything.
It does. God is never weary of his people in a way that makes him abhor them. Even when his anger is turned against them, the scripture says it's for a small moment, and it's always for their eternal good. But Spurgeon has a wonderful line. He says, grief asks strange questions.
Grief makes us surmise impossible terrors. That phrase just jumped off the page for me. We imagine God has put us away like an old coat, but the text reminds us he hates putting away.
And then the psalm moves from that feeling of rejection to this very visual description of God's anger. It asks, why doth thine anger smoke against the sheep of thy pasture?
That imagery, smoking anger, is so vivid. Why smoke? Why not just say fire?
Well, Spurgeon asks us to look really closely at the words there. If the anger were a roaring, devouring fire, what would happen to the sheep?
They'd be consumed. Instantly.
Instantly. The fact that it's smoking suggests that the anger hasn't yet burst into a devouring flame.
So even in the description of God's wrath, there's a little hint of mercy hidden in there.
I think so, yes. Smoke is terrible. It's irritating, it blinds you, it chokes you, it darkens the day, it represents confusion and misery.
But it's not the end.
It's not the consuming fire that destroys utterly. It suggests the fire is smoldering, but it's being held back. It's a warning, not an execution.
And the object of this anger is the sheep of thy pasture. That seems like a very specific metaphor to use. He doesn't say your warriors or your priests.
No, he says sheep.
Why?
I think it highlights two things. Their helplessness and their ownership.
Okay, helplessness makes sense. Sheep are, pretty silly and defenseless creatures. They can't fight a wolf, let alone an angry God.
Right. But even more than that, they are owned by the shepherd.
And Spurgeon makes a great point here. He says it's a terrible thing for a shepherd to be angry with his own flock.
It is. I mean, if a stranger gets angry with your dog, it doesn't matter much. But if the shepherd, whose entire job is to protect and care for the sheep, is angry with them,
then they're truly lost.
Yeah.
There's nowhere else to go.
Exactly. The plea is basically, Lord, we're just sheep, we're weak, we're silly, but we're gonna your property. Why would you be so wroth with your own investment?
And that idea of ownership flows right into verse 2, which I think is one of the strongest theological arguments in the whole psalm.
Remember thy congregation, which thou hast purchased of old.
This is where you can really see the Reformed doctrine of redemption just shining through.
Oh, absolutely. The plea isn't based on the sheep's good behavior or their merit. It's based entirely on the blood mark on the sheep. It's the argument from the purchase.
Which thou hast purchased of old. This isn't a new deal.
No, the church is no new purchase. Spurgeon reminds us that from before the foundation of the world, the chosen were regarded as redeemed by the Lamb who was slain.
So the argument is, can ancient love just die out? Can an eternal purpose be frustrated by this?
That's the question.
Yeah.
And it connects right to the doctrine of particular redemption or definite atonement. If God actually paid an infinite price for a specific people,
He can't just lose them. Otherwise, the purchase was for nothing. The payment didn't work.
that's the logic of the prayer. It's flawless. If he paid the price, they are his. Spurgeon asks, can he desert his blood-bought and forsake his redeemed? And the theological answer has to be, no, that's impossible.
The woes of Calvary are the security of the saints.
What a line. If Christ died for them, they cannot be cast off forever.
The text also calls the people the rod of thine inheritance. I have to admit, I wasn't totally sure what rod meant here until I read the notes. Is it a rod of discipline?
That's a good guess, but in this specific context, no. It's a reference to a land surveyor's rod.
Oh, okay.
In the ancient world, you'd measure out your property boundaries with a measuring reed or a rod. So the rod of thine inheritance means this is the portion of land I have measured out for myself.
It's a symbol of boundaries and exclusive ownership.
Exactly. It means this plot of land is mine. And the argument just keeps building. No prince willingly gives up his own kingdom. If God has measured out the church as his own private garden, will he just let the enemy trample all over it?
And then the plea gets even more specific, even more local. this Mount Zion wherein thou hast dwelt.
The argument of habitation. So first, you bought us. Second, you measured us out as your own. Third, you actually live here.
It's a bold argument, isn't it? Is asking God to defend his own house.
It's incredibly bold. Spurgeon notes that this was likely written with the solid temple in mind, not just the tent from David's time. The destruction described is of carved work, a substantial building.
So the psalmist is saying, Lord, are you going to allow this sacred place, the place where your glory literally resided, to be desecrated by heathens? Defend your home.
And speaking of that destruction, verse 3 has this really striking request. Lift up thy feet unto the perpetual desolations.
I love that anthropomorphism. It pictures God as just sitting there, observing, maybe with his arms folded.
And the psalmist yells out, step out, lift up your feet, come quickly.
It implies a heavy tread, doesn't it? Like a giant coming to survey the damage his enemies have done.
Yes, or a judge coming to execute a sentence. The context is that the enemy has done wickedly in the sanctuary. Every broken stone in the ruins is crying out to God for justice. The psalmist wants God to walk through the rubble and see with his own eyes what they've done to his house.
And what they've done is just horrific. Which brings us to the second section of our discussion, this desecration of the sanctuary in verses 4 through 8.
The first thing Spurgeon notes is the contrast in sounds. Verse 4 says, thine enemies roar in the midst of thy congregations.
Where the saints once sang like angels.
Now the enemies roar like wild beasts.
Is the intrusion of blasphemy into the holy meeting place. Spurgeon compares them to lions. They have no respect for the solemn gathering.
Where the reading of the law and the singing of songs once filled the air, now you just have the shouting of soldiers and the mockery of the heathen.
And then it says, they set up their ensigns for signs. That feels like a play on words.
It is, very much so. A sign in the Old Testament often referred to the tokens of God's covenant. The Sabbath, the sacrifices, the ordinances. The enemy has taken all those away.
And replaced them with their own ensign.
Our military standards, their flags, their idols. They've replaced the sacraments of God with the emblems of their own power and their own false gods.
And Spurgeon, as he always does, makes a very sharp modern application here. He doesn't just leave this back in Babylon.
No, he rarely does he? He connects us directly to the theological battles of his own day, and frankly of our day, too. He talks about papists, Arians, and neologians.
Neologians. That's a term you don't hear very often. Who's he talking about?
It refers to the theological liberals and rationalists of the 19th century. Neo-wallogeny literally means new word. These were scholars who were bringing new interpretations to Scripture.
Stripping away the supernatural, denying miracles, that sort of thing.
That's it, questioning the inspiration of the Bible. So Spurgeon is saying that those who bring these new words or this carnal wisdom to replace the ancient truths.
They're setting up their own ensigns.
They're setting up superstition and human philosophy in the place of the cross.
He says the horror a Jew felt seeing an idol in the temple is the same horror a believer should feel, seeing false philosophy in the pulpit.
That is the classic Reformed stance. The pulpit is the place for God's truth. To replace the gospel with human philosophy is a desecration of the sanctuary. It is planting an enemy flag in God's holy territory.
He's incredibly militant about it.
He views the corruption of doctrine as a far worse tragedy than the burning of a physical building.
Though the destruction of the building is described so vividly in verses 5 and 6, with the axes and hammers.
And there's a bitter irony there that Spurgeon really highlights. He points out the contrast between the construction of the temple and its destruction.
In Solomon's day, men were famous for lifting up axes against the thick trees, the cedars of Lebanon.
It was a noble work. To chop down a tree to build God's house was an act of worship. You were famous for it.
But now,
the enemy uses those same tools, axes, to smash the carved work to pieces. And they're just as proud of destroying as the builders were of erecting.
And this is where we get that classic Spurgeon line. He's lamenting the state of the church in his day, and he says, "Oh, for an hour of Luther's hatchet or Calvin's mighty axe."
It's just a brilliant turn of phrase. He's wishing for men who would use their axes to strike at error rather than striking at truth.
He sees the modern critics of his time hacking away at the gospel, breaking down the carved work of doctrine, the atonement, the resurrection, the inspiration of Scripture.
And he's just longing for the reformers to come back.
Not to build, but to fight.
To swing their axes in defense of the truth. To clear away the thorns and briars of heresy. It's a call for theological courage.
The destruction doesn't stop with axes, though. Verse 7 says, "They have cast fire into thy sanctuary."
And Fire denotes a kind of total erasure. The malice just knows no bounds. The goal isn't just to damage the building, it's to extirpate the very presence of God from the land.
Extirpate, to root out completely.
Like Haman in the book of Esther, or Pharaoh in Exodus, the enemy says, "Let us destroy them together." They want to wipe the name of Israel and, by extension, the name of Christ right off the map.
But Spurgeon offers a little bit of reassurance here, even in the middle of the fire.
He does. He reminds us of the burning bush. The church is so often in the fire, it's often surrounded by flames, but it is never consumed. The intent of the enemy is total destruction, but God preserves his people, even in the furnace.
Now, verse 8 brings up a historical controversy that the source material spends a good bit of time on. It says, they have burned up all the synagogues of God in the land.
Right. And this is where the dating of the psalm gets really tricky. The big question is, did synagogues even exist before the Babylonian captivity?
Spurgeon cites a couple of scholars on this, Prideaux and McCall. What's the conflict between them?
Well, Prideaux takes the view that synagogues couldn't have existed before the captivity. His logic is that synagogues require the public reading of the law.
Right.
But we know from the story of Josiah that copies of the law were incredibly rare. I mean, Josiah was shocked just to find one copy in the temple. So if there were no Bibles, how could there be synagogues?
That seems like a pretty solid argument. You can't have a Bible study without any Bibles.
It's logical, it is. But then McCall argues that the argument from silence is weak. He says there must have been gathering places for people on Sabbaths and new moons. He cites the Shunammite woman in 2 Kings who went to see the prophet on those days. Where did she go? She went to a meeting.
So where does Spurgeon land on this?
He seems to side with the idea that the word used here, mode, just refers to assemblies or meeting places. Whether they were formal synagogues, as we know them later on, is debatable.
But the point is the enemy strategy.
Exactly. The strategy was to destroy every single place where the faithful gathered for worship.
If you stop the worship, you scatter the people.
You cut off the lifeblood of the nation's faith. If you burn the meeting places, the community itself starts to disintegrate.
And that disintegration leads directly to the terrible silence that's described in our third section, verses 9 through 11. It starts with, "We see not our signs."
And this is the deep spiritual depression of the believer. They're looking for the tokens of God's presence, the markers of his favor, and they see nothing.
Spurgeon lists what some of those missing signs were for Israel. It's quite a devastating list.
It's the total loss of the supernatural. The Ark of the Covenant is gone. The fire from heaven that used to consume the sacrifices is gone. The Shekinah, that glory cloud that dwelt between the cherubim, it's gone.
The Urim and Thummim for guidance also lost.
Gone. It's not just that they lost a building, they felt like they'd lost the direct line to heaven.
And Spurgeon applies this to us today. He talks about those times when a believer loses their evidences of grace.
Yes. When you're just groping in darkness, you don't feel the presence of the Spirit. You can't see any fruit in your life. The comfort of the Word just isn't there. It's a spiritual famine. A famine of comfort.
And explicitly, verse 9 says, there is no more any prophet.
The famine of the Word. This is the worst judgment of all, when God stops speaking, when there's no faithful pastor to declare the truth. And Spurgeon issues a warning here.
He says that contempt of the word leads God to withdraw it.
It does. If we don't value the prophets, God will remove them. He says a congregation without a faithful pastor is just a starving flock.
And the misery is all compounded by that phrase, neither is there any among us that knoweth how long.
That uncertainty is just brutal, isn't it? If you know a trial will end in a month, you can brace yourself. You can count down the days.
But an indefinite trial, a trial with no end in sight, that just breaks the spirit.
It does. It creates this overwhelming sense of hopelessness. Will this last forever? That's the question that just haunts the sufferer.
And this desperation leads to a very bold, almost shocking prayer in verse 11.
Why withdrawest thou thy hand, even thy right hand? Pluck it out of thy bosom.
That is some startling imagery. He's picturing God standing there with his arms folded, his right hand, the hand of power tucked away inside his robe.
Just resting while his people are being slaughtered.
And he says, pluck it out. It sounds almost disrespectful. I mean, can we really talk to God like that?
Spurgeon would say yes in this context. It's the boldness of a desperate faith. He calls it a rapture of prayer.
A rapture of prayer.
Yes. Dying men have to venture for their lives. The petitioner knows that God's inaction is effectively a victory for the enemy. So he's appealing to God's own honor. He's saying, for your own sake, stop folding your arms. Strike.
It's a real shift from save us to defend yourself, which is a theme that really grows as the psalm goes on.
It is. And right after this incredibly intense plea, the psalmist does something amazing. He pivots. He stops looking at the ruins around him and starts looking at the history books.
Which brings us to section 4, verse 12. For God is my king of old.
This is the turning point of the entire psalm. It's a deliberate act of the will. He looks away from the ruins of the temple and looks back at the history of redemption.
The logic seems simple, but really solid. If God is the ancient king, he hasn't changed.
What he did once, he can do again.
And he starts talking about some pretty wild stuff. Sea monsters, thou breakest the heads of the dragons in the waters, and Leviathan.
Verses 13 and 14, yes. This is a clear look back to the Exodus and the crossing of the Red Sea. The dragons and Leviathan are poetic symbols for Egypt and for Pharaoh himself.
Spurgeon mentions a literal interpretation here, connecting Leviathan to the crocodile.
He does. The crocodile was a major symbol of Egypt. And he mentions this fascinating numismatic detail, a coin or a medal from Julius Caesar's time that depicts a crocodile with the inscription, Egypt taken.
So breaking the head of Leviathan is a poetic but also a very political way of saying God crushed the power of Pharaoh and his army.
Precisely. But then you get this very strange phrase, and gavest him to be meat to the people inhabiting the wilderness.
Right. That's one of the most difficult lines in the whole psalm. You gave Leviathan his meat. What does that even mean?
Spurgeon offers a literal interpretation first, citing a tradition from Diodorus.
He mentions the ichthyophagy.
Yes, the fish-eaters, tribes who lived along the coast of the Red Sea. The literal idea is that when the tide turned and the Egyptians drowned, the sea might have cast up not just the bodies, but fish and sea creatures, or even the supplies from the Egyptian army.
So literally providing food for the people in the desert, scavenging the supplies of a drowned army.
It's a graphic image. But Spurgeon, being a preacher who's always concerned with the soul, really prefers the spiritual interpretation.
Which is?
That the destruction of Egypt became food for Israel's faith. The memory of that great victory was their sustenance.
Ah, I see.
When they were in the wilderness, hungry and afraid, they could feed on the fact that their God had destroyed Leviathan.
The spoil of the enemy becomes the provision of the saint.
That's it. God gives us former mercies as food to feed on while we're in the wilderness of present trouble. We look back at how God saved us in the past, how he crushed that dragon, and that memory strengthens us for today. It's memory as nutrition.
And the psalmist continues this tour of history in the next verse, verse 15. Thou didst cleave the fountain and the flood.
This is pointing to the crossing of the Jordan River. And there's a little note from Jonathan Edwards here that's really insightful.
The Great Awakening preacher.
The very same. Edwards notes that the text mentions both the fountain and the flood. This signifies that God handled both the ordinary river water, the fountain, and the flood, which was the extraordinary extra water from the harvest rains.
So the Jordan was at flood stage when they crossed.
It was. So God didn't just conquer the river. He conquered the river at its absolute strongest and most impassable. He dried up mighty rivers.
It just emphasizes that no barrier is too high for God.
Right. So the psalmist has established God's power over history, over nations. But then, in section 5, the scope widens even further. He moves from history to creation itself, to nature.
Verses 16 and 17. The day is thine, the night also is thine.
Why does he go to nature here? We were just talking about armies and temples and rivers.
It seems like a strange turn.
But it's about establishing total sovereignty. If God rules the simple alternations of time, day, and night, then he also rules the nights of the church as well as the days.
There's a poem Spurgeon quotes something like, there is not more night than day.
Yes, it's a reminder of balance. God has ordained the darkness just as much as he has ordained the light. The night isn't an accident, it is thine. It belongs to God. It's under his control.
And speaking of light, verse 16 says, thou hast prepared the light in the sun.
Right, and here we get into a little bit of 19th century scientific apologetics, which is fascinating. Spurgeon cites writers like Sharon Turner and Paxton Hood to defend the Genesis account.
This is about the light before the sun issue, isn't it?
It is. In Genesis, Moses places the creation of light on day 1, but the sun isn't created until day 4. And for centuries, critics mocked this. They'd say, how can you have light without the sun? This proves the Bible is scientifically illiterate.
It did seem like a pretty glaring error for a long time.
But Spurgeon points out that science eventually vindicated Moses. By the 19th century, scientists understood that light, or what they called the fluid of light, actinism, is distinct from the solar orb. Light exists independently of the sun. The sun is just a holder or a projector of that light.
So the Bible was ahead of the critics the whole time.
As is so often the case. And Spurgeon then dwells on the moral influence of light. It represents order, purity, health. God prepared it.
Then the psalmist moves to geography. Thou hast set all the borders of the earth.
And Spurgeon quotes a German pastor, Sturm, who reflects on the globe's shape. It's a classic argument from design. The earth is round.
Why does that matter?
Well, if it were square or a cone or a hexagon, the distribution of light, heat, and wind would be totally messed up.
It's the Goldilocks principle. Just right.
Exactly. If the shape were different, much of the earth would be uninhabitable, either drowned in water or a dried-up desert. The borders, where the land ends and the sea begins, are set by God to allow for civilization and contact.
And then the seasons. Thou hast made summer and winter.
This is the final argument from nature. God made winter, and winter is cold and dead and harsh. It looks like everything is dying.
But it's part of the plan.
It's a necessary part of the plan. Nature rests in winter. It's a secret activity that prepares for the life of spring.
And the application for the suffering church is just. It's right there on the surface, isn't it?
It's unavoidable. If God arranges the seasons of nature with such profound wisdom, then the winter of the church, this time of desolation and silence, is also part of a wise plan. It's not an accident. It's a season prepared by God for a future purpose.
That brings us to our final section, section 6, which is perhaps the most touching part of the whole psalm.
Yeah.
The covenant plea.
It starts in verse 19. O deliver not the soul of thy turtle dove unto the multitude of the wicked.
Why a turtle dove? Of all the birds God could have chosen, eagles, hawks, sparrows, why this one?
It's such a layered and beautiful image. First, the turtle dove is weak. It's silly, in the Old English sense of being simple and defenseless. It has no talons, no sharp beak for fighting back.
It's also known as a mournful bird.
Yes, the sighing sisters, they were sometimes called. The dove mourns for its lost mate, so it represents fidelity and grief. And it's innocent, harmless.
Spurgeon also mentions a historical note about how Arabs and Egyptians would spare the turtle dove.
Right, for the sake of hospitality. The bird is so trusting and gentle that even in rough cultures it was often spared. The psalmist is using this to tug at God's heart. Lord, we are your turtle dove. We are weak, we are mourning, we are innocent. Don't give us to the beasts.
And then comes the strongest plea in the entire psalm, the one he's been building towards. Verse 20, have respect unto the covenant.
This is the sheet anchor.
For those of us who aren't sailors, what exactly is a sheet anchor?
The sheet anchor is the biggest, heaviest anchor on the ship. It's the one you only drop as a last resort when the storm is at its absolute worst and the ship is about to be smashed on the rocks.
And for the believer, that final, unbreakable anchor is the covenant.
It is. When our works fail, when our own righteousness is nothing but filthy rags, when our sin testifies against us, the covenant remains. Spurgeon says God can't look at the sinner because the sinner is vile, so the prayer asks him to look at the covenant instead.
Because another way of saying, look at Christ. Look at the agreement that was sealed in blood.
That's it. The covenant is the one thing that binds God's own honor to the survival of his people. It's the unbreakable argument. It's saying, you promised, you swore by your own name, you cannot break your word.
The verse continues with a very dark description of the world outside the covenant. The dark places of the earth are full of the habitations of cruelty.
This is a profound sociological observation, really. There is a direct link between spiritual darkness and physical cruelty. Where the light of the gospel is missing, humanity just descends into brutality.
And Spurgeon gives some chilling examples from the source texts about heathen nations in his time. And we should be clear, he's reporting the realities of the 19th century as he saw them.
He is. He mentions China and the practice of infanticide carts literally collecting dead infants before dawn in Beijing, cast out like rubbish. He talks about India and the practice of sati, where widows were burned alive on their husbands' funeral pyres.
He also mentions the thugs, that secret fraternity of murderers devoted to the goddess Kali.
It's a stark reminder, isn't it? We can sometimes romanticize ancient cultures or non-Christian religions, but Spurgeon is pointing out the reality. Heathenism is not innocent, it is cruel.
And only the light the gospel can cure this. The dark places are habitats of cruelty. The church, this little turtle dove, is surrounded by it.
And that's why the plea to the covenant is so urgent. Lord, if you don't save us, this cruelty will just take over everything.
Finally, the psalm ends with that shift we hinted at earlier, verse 22. Arise, O God, plead thine own cause.
The psalmist stops asking God to save them and starts asking God to save his own name. Remember how the foolish man reproacheth thee daily.
It's not just about us anymore. It's about your reputation.
Precisely. The enemy is blaspheming God's name, and Spurgeon notes that the sinner is like a crocodile that just grows bigger and bigger. Quamdu vivit crescit, as long as it lives, it grows. Sinners don't stop sinning unless they're stopped by death.
So the prayer for judgment, what we sometimes call the imprecatory nature of it, asking God to destroy the enemy, it's actually born out of a zeal for God's honor.
It is. It's a cry against the harlot of Babylon, against Antichrist. It's asking God to vindicate his own holiness in a world that openly mocks him. If God doesn't strike, his name is dragged through the mud.
What a walk this psalm takes us on. I mean, from the depths of feeling cast off to standing in the ruins of the sanctuary, through that awful silence, then back to the Red Sea, through the laws of nature, and finally dropping that anchor in the covenant.
It's the roadmap for the suffering believer. It shows us how to navigate the dark night of the soul.
So if we had to summarize the key takeaways for you, the listener, what would they be?
Well, I think first and foremost, affliction does not mean rejection. The smoke is not the fire. You may be chastised, but if you are one of his sheep, you are not cast off.
Okay, what's the second one?
Memory is a spiritual weapon. You have to use the history of God's victories, Leviathan, the Jordan, the resurrection, to feed your present faith. Eat the meat of the Leviathan while you're in your wilderness.
I love that. And third?
The God of nature is the God of the church. The same one who rules the cold winter and the dark night is the same God who is ruling over your suffering. Your darkness is under his dominion and his boundaries.
And finally, the sheet anchor.
The covenant. It is the final, unbreakable argument in prayer. When you feel you have nothing else to say, when your own heart condemns you, you can still say, Lord, have respect unto the covenant.
That brings us to our closing thought. We always like to leave you with something to mull over.
We've talked a lot about the silence of God and about the defenselessness of the turtle dove. So think about this. The church is, by all worldly standards, weak. It is surrounded by roaring beasts.
It's been attacked by axes and hammers and fire for 2,000 years. Empires have tried to crush it. Philosophies have tried to dismantle it.
And yet, here it is. It's still here.
Hmm.
If the only real defense is the covenant, then the continued existence of the church today might just be the greatest miracle of all.
A bush that is always burning but is never consumed.
Exactly. The very fact that you and I are sitting here talking about the psalm thousands of years after it was written is proof that God remembers his turtle dove.
That is a powerful thought. We'd encourage you to read Psalm 74 this week. Read it through this covenant lens.
Indeed.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Soli Deo Gloria.
Soli Deo Gloria.